Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Any chance you'll reconsider leaving, Secretary Gates?
No, sir.
I didn't think so, but I just can't thank you enough for what you've done for the country, Admiral Mullen. And I just want to say something about the administration here. I know we have our differences, but when it comes to Iraq and Afghanistan, I think the policies you've created, the policies the President has supported have been very sound. And we're about to reap the benefits of operations that have been tough, difficult, sometimes mismanaged, but that's the nature of war. And we're very close in Iraq. So I just want to build on what Senator Reid said. I'm going to be the ranking member of the Foreign Operations Council on Appropriation. And I'd like for you to put in writing to me and Senator Lee what you said about this account. Let's give a real-world example. What did it mean in terms of the Egyptian crisis to have a good dialogue with the Egyptian military, Admiral Mullen?
It was huge. It was the benefits of 30 years of investment, of the interaction we've had with thousands of them in our schools, the values that have rubbed off over time with them, the ability to sustain those contacts, and then see them act in such a responsible way.
Well, I think that's a real-world example of where 30 years of investment really paid off. And this account has been reduced to $45 billion in the House. And I do share my House colleagues' desire to reduce spending, and no account is above scrutiny. But the $5 billion that is flowing to Pakistan, Iraq, and Afghanistan on the civilian side, the Overseas Contingency Operation account, what are you telling us that basically that should be seen sort of as emergency spending and not counted against their baseline?
Well, I think, I mean, certainly some of it tied to the military, but I think the Kerry Lugar-Berman piece, that's a 5-year program at $1.5 billion a year. That isn't military, and that's what we were talking about earlier. Sustaining that is going to be critical, not just now, but in the long term.
Well, I guess the point I'm making, we're surging on the civilian side as we draw down our troops. And the civilian-military partnership is essential to holding and building.
Right.
There are funds going to Pakistan, Iraq, and Afghanistan on the civilian side that I think will be just as important as any brigade, and I would like to treat those funds as a national security asset. And I will do everything I can on the Republican side in the Senate to make sure that we protect those funds.
Sure.
You can't hold and build without. Now, here's what awaits the American people. We're talking about fiscal austerity at home. What is the percentage of GDP spending on defense when you count all appropriations?
Well, two facts. First, if it's first, the base budget alone is 3.7% of GDP. If you take all the war funding for FY11 plus the base budget, it's about 4.9% of GDP.
Historically,
but there's another fact that's worth noting, and that is that as a percentage of federal outlays, with the exception of the late 90s and the early 2000s, at 18.9%, it is the lowest level of federal percentage of outlays since before World War II.
Okay, now we need to understand that as a Congress here. The Secretary of Defense has just told us, and since World War II terms, we're on the very low end at a time when I think the threats to our nation are growing exponentially. Now, as we pull down in Iraq, it is your belief if the Iraqi government would ask for American troops to be left behind to perform the three functions you suggested, it would be in our national security interest to say yes?
Yes, sir, I believe that.
Now, there's a fourth component, security for those who are going to be in the lead, the State Department, the Department of Justice, Agriculture Department, the police trainers. My concern is if we don't have a sufficient military footprint, then the State Department literally has to build its own security apparatus, which will be in excess of $5 billion. Do you think all things being equal, it would be better for U.S. military to be able to continue to provide security?
Yes, sir, I do, and partly because we would also have the helicopters and things like that, the private security contractors that state's going to have to hire to perform that role will not have some of the quote-unquote enablers that we have.
Well, see, this is the dilemma, and we need to know this soon because the State Department needs to build capacity. Do they buy helicopters? Do they buy 54 MRAPs? And is it wise to hire a private contractor army to replace the American military if the Iraqis will allow the American military to perform that function? So the sooner we know the answer to that question, the more likely we are to be successful, because I have grave concerns about building a State Department army. And so that's just my 2 cents worth. Detainees. Admiral Mullen, our special operators are all over the world as I speak. Is that correct? And the threat from terrorism is just not confined to Iraq and Afghanistan.
It is not.
What would we do as a nation if we were able to capture a high-level al-Qaeda operative in any country outside of Iraq or Afghanistan, let's say Somalia, Yemen, as an examples? What would we do with that detainee?
We don't have an answer to that question.
See, now, this is a big deal to me. We're in a war, and capturing people is part of intelligence gathering, is an essential component of this war. Do you agree with that, Admiral Mullen?
Right.
It is better to capture someone than it is to kill them in a lot of cases. Is that correct?
It is.
It's hard to capture someone if you don't have a jail to put them. And all those on the other side who want to stop renditions, we need to come up with an American jail, because the only alternative is to kill them or go to renditions. I hope, Mr. Chairman, that sometimes this year, Republicans and Democrats can have a breakthrough on this issue to help our men and women fighting this war, because it is a very spot to put the tough spot to put special operators in. And our CIA. Our CIA doesn't interrogate terrorist suspects any longer. And these are things we need to talk about and get an answer to. Afghanistan. Not only is it miraculous what General Caldwell has done, it's stunning to me that we're in 2009 and 10, and 30% of the NCO Corps in Afghanistan could read. When he took over, he tested the Afghan Army for literacy. And on paper, every NCO should read at the 3rd grade level. And when they tested the NCO Corps, 70% could not read at the 3rd grade level. And he is going about fixing that. So you're dead right. But we need to know, after 8 years of involvement, 90% of the Afghan Army could not shoot to NATO standards 18 months ago. So after all these years, we're just finally getting it right. In many ways, we've been in Afghanistan with the right formulation for about 18 months. Is that a fair statement?
That's a fair statement. And it's a very difficult discussion to have, because it was 10 years ago when this started.
I just want the American people to know that we've made mistakes, but we're finally getting it right. One last thought. When 2014 comes, I am very optimistic that there will be a better Afghan police and army than we have today, that we can transition. But I've been discussing among my colleagues and others about what an enduring relationship with Afghanistan would look like. It is my belief, Mr. Chairman, that a political, economic, and military alliance with the Afghan people at their request would be incredibly beneficial to our long-term national security interest and could be a game changer in the region. To both of you, what do you believe the effect of an enduring military relationship would be on the future security of Afghanistan and the region as a whole if the Afghans requested of us to have joint air bases past 2015? Would that be something you think it would be wise for us to talk about and consider?
Absolutely, Senator. I think that, to go to Admiral Mullen's comments about Pakistan a little while ago, there is a big question in the whole region whether we will stick around. And it's in Afghanistan, it's in Pakistan, it's all over the area. And a security agreement with Afghanistan that provided for a continuing relationship and some kind of joint facilities and so on for training, for counterterrorism and so on beyond 2014, I think would be very much in our interest. I think that it would serve as a barrier to Iranian influence coming from the West. I think it would serve as a barrier to a reconstitution of the Taliban and others coming from the border areas in Pakistan. So I think it would be a stabilizing, have a stabilizing effect, not just in Afghanistan, but in the region.
One final thought, and I hate to run over. Would you also agree that it would give an edge to the Afghan security forces in perpetuity over the Taliban, and you might, with that kind of relationship, get by with a somewhat smaller army?
Absolutely.